Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 188, October 21st to October 27th, 1864. Last week we talked about the Confederate covert operation of the raid on St. Albans, Vermont. While the raid was unsuccessful, it was one of the weirder events of the war, in my opinion. We wrapped up the 1864 Valley Campaign with the Union victory at the Battle of Cedar Creek as well. This week, we head out to Missouri and check in on what's going on there. We will backtrack a bit to talk about Price's raid of 1864 and its disastrous results. Of course, before we do that, though, let's talk about our Patreon content just a little bit. And we had a picture slideshow posted. That is from the Battle of the Crater, modern-day battlefield, Petersburg battlefield there. And pairs nicely, I think, with some of the other content that we've done, Cold Mountain, the movie that depicts those events. And then, of course, our episode that we had back in July. So we have that posted to the Patreon. And as we get to the end of October here and move into November, we will be going back to a movie review. And we had kind of mentioned this when we talked about the beefsteak raid, but we'll be doing Alvarez Kelly, which stars William Holden, and that's going to be a movie depicting essentially the events of the beefsteak raid, albeit a little bit more dramatic than maybe it actually was, although it's a fairly dramatic event of the war in terms of getting a large amount of beef cattle back for the Confederates. It's certainly a huge morale boost for them in a period where they are backs to the wall here. The siege of Petersburg is going on. Things aren't going well in Atlanta, so dramatic probably at the time as well, but we have the movie here, and we'll be talking about the parallels with the movie and, of course, the actual historical events. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, we have that. As we mentioned, we have picture slideshows, we have memoir reviews as well. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show, so very greatly appreciated. It's been some time since we talked about Sterling Price. In some ways, it's interesting. We sort of began a lot of our early actions with him, and he's been popping in and out of our story ever since. Well, one thing we have mentioned is that Price is very concerned with the reclamation of Missouri for the Confederacy. At one point early in the war, he had captured Lexington and was threatening control of the border state. Since that time, all other efforts had failed. Marmaduke had launched some raids, and Hyman would operate during the Prairie Grove campaign in the vicinity, but otherwise, it has remained pretty solidly in the hands of the North. Price has bumped heads with Jefferson Davis, and a chunk of his state guard units have been sent abroad, no longer close to their home. Well, in an effort to maybe divert some resources from other theaters, Price is finally going to get the opportunity to get into Missouri and put his money where his mouth was. You see, the goal is going to be to try to spread the Union armies once again so that they are not supporting one another. Sherman is going to soon be tearing through Georgia, and Hood is going to be moving away from him, hopefully forcing troops to give chase. Taylor was supposed to be moving from the Trans-Mississippi to join the efforts around Atlanta. Remember, he had been on the shortlist for individuals to take over operations there. But this move was going to be impossible, considering that this region was cut off and the Confederates under Kirby Smith already had their hands full. Price launching a raid into Missouri was going to satisfy Richmond with their need to have this theater do something. Remember that the big problem for the Union during the Red River campaign is not necessarily the idea of it, although the execution was a little bit lacking with Nathaniel Banks, but the problem for Grant was that it's a campaign that was not able to support the other campaigns that were being launched, the other offensives that Sherman was launching, that Grant was launching in the Eastern Theater there, the main theater of the war. So that is a problem. And if the Confederates can kind of force that problem onto the Union, then maybe there could be some hope, although it is going to be a long shot. Originally, infantry was going to be accompanying the invasion, but Price would be forced to move with only 12,000 cavalry. Divisions under James Fagan, John Marmaduke, and Joe Shelby would move out accompanied by 14 pieces of artillery. Hopefully, he would be able to gather in reinforcements from Missouri. The quality of potential troops was going to be subpar, though. Guerrillas and otherwise pro-Confederate civilians would make up anything gained in the territory, and they would focus more on reprisals and looting than being an invading army. Facing Price was going to be a much larger force. A.J. Smith and his corps was still going to be in the area. Alf Pleasanton would operate with some cavalry, and Curtis will have an army also available to mobilize. William Stark Rosecrans would be the commander for the district, so we have a little bit of a who's who of characters we have seen in previous episodes. All told, though, the Union Army would be able to bring some 35,000 to the field, so Price was going to have his work cut out for him. It's kind of telling that Kirby Smith doesn't want to commit any infantry to the invasion. It was originally slated that he was supposed to provide some for Price, but obviously Price is a hard person to get along with, number one, and number two, it's very dubious whether this mission is going to succeed. So let's just make it a raid with cavalry. It can be very quick. Marmaduke has shown that in the past where he's able to get into Missouri. He's able to get out very quickly, being chased by Union forces, however. So that's going to be sort of the idea. And if Price can magically whip up a grand army in Missouri, then yeah, there could be continued talks about whether additional support will come. Sitting at the end of August, the raid would begin by heading into southeast Missouri, moving toward St. Louis. A target of the raiders would be Pilot Knob in Iron County. Now, Pilot Knob was important because of an iron ore mine, as the name would suggest. This would be an important area that had been on the fringes of our story early in the conflict. Grant would lead his Illinois regiment there, and Jeff Thompson would operate in the vicinity. Protecting this work would be a fort called Fort Davidson, named after Brigadier General John Wynne Davidson, a native of Fairfax County, Virginia, whom we have met before. He will continue to serve after the war, gaining the nickname Black Jack for his service with black troops in the West. We have a description of the fort by a veteran. Fort Davidson was hexagonal on each side, 40 yards long, or 240 yards around, and 80 yards across. There was a sally port on the south side, just aside from the head of the south rifle pit. So in going into the fort, you stepped into the heavy door of the sally port, and you were there directly under the south parapet, and then to your left was a stairway. On going up the stairway, you emerged through a trapdoor into the fort. On the east side, facing the old Pilot Knob Railroad Depot, was the gateway, with a heavy drawbridge that hinged to heavy timbers at the gate entrance. Then, with windlasses inside attached to high, strong posts, this bridge was drawn up by means of ropes extending from the windlasses up over pulleys at the top of the post, and then attached to the outer corners of the bridge. Fort Davidson then mounted 4 32-pound siege pieces, or pivot guns, some 12 or 14 feet long, and if we remember rightly, they weighed 9,000 pounds. Then there were 3 24-pound howitzers with limbers so they could be hauled on the field, some as field pieces, as heavy field artillery. Also, there were 2 mortars about the same caliber as the 24-pound howitzers. As we have read several descriptions of the old fort now and its surroundings, we will now add our might of its position and surroundings. So now we will stand in Fort Davidson and look around. The fort stands on the point of a very high ridge or roll of land, which extended south from Cedar Mountain on the north to Stouts Knob Creek, which flows from the northwest. Looking westward, there is a mountain something over a mile away, which bears away to the southwest. Extending from the fort to this mountain is a rolling flat or plateau of low ridges or rolls. Also, these rolls were covered more or less with brushes. So not only does that give us a good idea of what the fort might look like, right? Sounds pretty intricate, as some field fortifications are, and some, as we have seen in our story, are not. They're pretty hastily built, but this one has been seemingly perfected. It's got drawbridge, has some pretty heavy armament here, some siege pieces, so definitely is going to be a big target and a big worry for the Confederates. Price would arrive with his divisions in late September. His forces would skirmish with the Missouri State Militia Cavalry pretty much continuously during the campaign. but arriving to Fort Davidson, they would see Thomas Ewing with some 1,000 or so defenders. Seeing this as maybe an opportunity to strike an early first victory, Price would authorize William Cabell to assault the work. His men were in the process of cutting off any retreat and the capture or otherwise elimination of the man who had launched Order Number 11, which would be a big win for Missouri. On September 27th, the same day as Centralia, further abroad in Missouri, Cabell would launch 3 assaults, each of which would be repulsed. The attacks would be dismounted and uncoordinated. Union troops in the works would be able to load for men on the firing line, adding to the firepower. This repulse also included the use of Ketchum grenades, which kind of looks like one of those Nerf footballs with a tail. Ewing would have a choice to make, though. The Confederates had lost anywhere from 500 to 1,000 men in the attacks, compared to 213 Union troops. The rebels were preparing to maybe bombard the fort, as it was surrounded by higher ground. Per our description, we kind of went over that, how it has some high ground around it. An officer of the Missouri State Militia had been captured and would be executed by the rebels. Seeing as the fort also contained United States colored troops, it was surmised everyone would probably be seeing the same fate. Ewing would evacuate his troops, miraculously slipping by the Confederates before lighting the powder magazine of the fort. Successfully escaped, Price would continue after them north. He would decline an attack on St. Louis and then Jefferson City, as both locations would be fortified, and the experience at Fort Davidson had taught Price that his troops were not capable of attacking enemy works. He would continue to track to the west as the Union forces started to converge. We have a full account of the battle from a newspaper after the war. The story of the battle. Last night, a veteran who took part in the fight and whose memory covers every material point toward the story of the battle in corroboration of the statement made by Rosecrans and the bravery of those who took part in the engagement. The Confederates had 3 divisions, or 12,000 men in arms, and these were commanded by General Price and Major Generals Cabell, Fagan, and Marmaduke. The Federals had 1 company of infantry of the Missouri State Militia, numbering 60 men, 1 company of the 2nd Missouri Volunteer Artillery, 2 companies of the 14th Iowa Volunteers, 2 companies of the 3rd Regiment, Missouri State Militia, 1 company of the 2nd Cavalry, Missouri State Militia, all numbering about 40 to the company, 5 companies of the 47th Regiment, Missouri Volunteer Infantry, 60 men to the company, 1 company of the 50th Missouri Volunteers, and some few citizens. All told, the Federals numbered less than 1,000 to their opponents. The Federals camped in the valley at the foot of Pilot Knob, and near the fort erected there, General Ewing was in command. Colonel Fletcher commanded the 47th Regiment, Major Wilson, the 3rd Cavalry, First Lieutenant David Murphy, the 50th Missouri, Captain Campbell, the 14th Iowa, Captain Montgomery, 1 company of the 2nd Missouri Artillery, Captain Wright, the 2nd Cavalry, and Lieutenant Felser, the 1st Infantry Missouri State Militia, acting as heavy artillery. The cavalry, commanded by Captain Wilson, took their position at the foot of the knob. Captain Campbell's command was located across Shepherd Mountain, with instructions to retire before any force that the outset appeared too heavy for them. The 47th Regiment and 1 company of the 50th Missouri were stationed in the ditch connecting to the fort with the town of Pilot Knob, while the 1st Regiment of the Missouri State Militia manned the 32 and 24-pound garrison guns. The 2nd Missouri Artillery also took up their station within the fort, mounting their 4 guns on a temporary platform. 2 additional pieces of artillery were placed in charge of Lieutenant Smiley. These were on the extreme flank of the infantry in the ditch at the edge of the town of Pilot Knob. For the Confederates, Shelby was sent around by way of Farmington with instructions to hold the road at Potosi, and from that point to St. Louis. Cabell and Fagan were placed in charge of the assaulting columns. Marmaduke held Shepherd Mountain with his artillery and supporting forces. Price stationed himself at Arcadia, 2 miles from the battleground. There had been skirmishing from the morning of September 26 until night, in the vicinity of Shutton Gap, below Arcadia. At night, Ewing resolved to make a stand and thus compel Price to develop his entire force. The fort was placed in condition to receive 4 light pieces. These were erected on platforms. On the morning of the 27th, the troops were in position and the battle was commenced by Marmaduke's division, taking possession of Shepherd Mountain and driving before it the 2 companies of the 14th Iowa, who returned by mountain slope and centered the fort by means of the ditch, connecting it with the foot of the mountain. Late in the morning, Marmaduke succeeded in planting 4 guns on the eastern slope of the mountain, directly opposite the fort. Lieutenant Murphy saw this move, but refused to open fire, desiring to give the Confederate general all the time he needed in which to plant his guns. General Ewing, on the other hand, kept insisting that they should open on Marmaduke with the garrison guns, but not a shot was fired until a Confederate force sent a ball into the Federal camp. This was the opening signal. Lieutenant Murphy jumped upon the platform and, training the 32-pounder, gave orders to fire, which were promptly obeyed. The shot struck on the slope and disabled one of Marmaduke's guns. This satisfied the Confederates for the first time that there was to be a fight, and rejoiced at the prospect. They sent up a cheer. From that moment, every gun in the fort was called into play. There was a duel of artillery that lasted half an hour, at the expiration of which Marmaduke was obliged to withdraw his battery out of range of the fire from the fort. As the Confederates retired, the assaulting column advanced. They covered the whole front of the valley between the fort and the town of Ironton, and lapping over the slopes of Pilot Knob, formed a solid line, crescent shape, the right half extending almost north and south, and the left half east and west. As soon as the great column made its appearance, each piece of artillery in the fort was made to speak, and the Confederates were in consequence compelled to form their assaulting lines under fire. In this emergency, the order to charge upon the fort was given without delay. While the column advanced, all guns in the fort were brought to bear. As the attacking party neared the fort, the infantry and cavalry had retired from their positions early in the day. The scene was of an interesting character. The little fort seemed to be belching forth sheets of flame. The artillerymen stood to their guns and fought like demons. Now and then a gunner flinched, but officers stood by and rallied the men. Occasionally, the artilleryman would express a desire to get ammunition, but was dissuaded by the officer saying, "Stay up there, we'll keep you supplied." Every man able to fight was compelled to stand up and face the enemy. The assaulting column, after a brief fight, saw that there was little chance of getting into the fort, as the ditch in front was so wide and deep as to form an impassable barrier, in view of the furious and unceasing fire. The first assault ended in the attacking party retiring a short distance, where they rallied, and aided by fresh troops advanced again. The second attempt proved no more successful than the first, and the Confederates then drew off in the direction of the town of Pilot Knob, with the object of finding a weaker spot. This gave the infantry stationed in the ditch north of the fort a chance to get in some work, which they improved, and the second assault, like the first, was a complete failure, the Confederates being repulsed. They effected but one lodgment, and that after retreating 2 miles to a point on the other side of Arcadia. The Confederates left more than 1,500 dead and wounded on the battlefield. The Federal losses amounted to but 90 killed and wounded. The battle ended at 4 p.m. September 27th, and less than an hour later, the Federals began the work of removing their wounded to the town of Pilot Knob, although that place had been in possession of the Confederates all day. The dead were buried in the fort, and preparations were made at once to abandon it, as by this time General Ewing had become convinced that its position was untenable. At midnight, all the forces were withdrawn. Only the heavy guns and caissons were left behind, and that's because there were no horses to draw them back. Ewing's troops marched out of the fort, and as they passed between Shepherd and Rock Mountain, they observed rebel campfires and the sentries of a brigade that had taken up their position during the night. It was intended by Price that the intervening space between the campfires and Rock Mountain should be filled by Shelby's division, and orders had been sent to him to that effect. As Shelby moved down to comply with these orders, his advance and Ewing's collided. Ewing, of course, was on the lookout, but Shelby was surprised, and as Ewing's forces advanced, the enemy retreated. This was at a small fork in the road, and near the town of Caledonia. Ewing, seeing that he could not reach the Iron Mountain track under the circumstances, took the road heading west, and in the direction of the town of Webster, intending, if Price continued his march to St. Louis, in accordance with his previous announcement, to be in position to make a demonstration on Price's flank when opportunity offered. He soon discovered, though, that such a move would not be permitted, and that Price had ordered General Clark, commanding the Confederate cavalry, to pursue and bring him to battle. Ewing declined to give battle, however, and marched on to Leesburg, and the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad, erected breastworks there, and prepared to give Price battle again. This, for some reason, Price declined, but instead marched on toward Jefferson City, with the Federal force from St. Louis in pursuit. So we have this account from a newspaper, and we read it for several reasons. I think you should know by now that in the course of this show that I like pulling together some primary source material, some contemporary sources that might have written about it at the time. I think it's also interesting to see with these newspaper articles, sometimes they're just kind of piecing together the events of these things that happened, right? Like this newspaper obviously was really interested in what happened at Pilot Knob. It's a local newspaper, so they wanted to make sure that they got the story right. So they're putting it together. It's kind of like a little mini paper, shall we say, about the battle. So it is very detailed, right? And obviously they're talking to firsthand accounts and individuals who are corroborating the story, and they're comparing and contrasting to try to figure out exactly what happened. So I like to read these because, like, once again, they are sort of research papers of their own. But the big takeaway I think we can actually take from this account that we might not have highlighted when we were talking about is that the Federals still have such a great advantage in terms of artillery. You know, Marmaduke is able to get onto this high ground. It's advantageous, right? You would think it would be, right? If you're on a mountain and you're shooting down into a position. You know, we talked about in the Eastern Theater, the main theater, we talked about Harper's Ferry and how it's surrounded by high ground. And if you own that high ground, you own Harper's Ferry, right? That's why it was so important back in 1862 that Jackson was able to get a foothold on those mountains, that high ground. So it would seemingly be a similar situation here. However, the Confederate artillery is not going to be of the same quality that Jackson probably has with his army in the main theater of the war. And therefore, even though they have a higher ground, they are facing the siege guns that are going to be far superior, right? These are 32 pounders, pretty heavy pieces. You know, we talk about 32 pounders a lot when we're talking about the navies and what they're using on ships, right? And so these are going to be pretty deadly compared to the Confederate pieces. And that's going to be kind of a common theme. It's usually a common thing that we talk about in the Trans-Mississippi, how the Confederates are ill-supplied out here. They don't have as great of a amount of resources as these other armies do, right? And so they're at a severe disadvantage. They don't have true infantry either, so they're attacking, right, with these dismounted cavalry. And yes, it's true that they would be used to fighting as infantry, right? These troops, they're still going to be dismounted cavalry, so they're not going to be quite the same as infantry. And if you're going to be assaulting these positions, that's kind of like what you need to have. Those are the two combinations. You need to have good artillery. You need to have infantry, right? And so that is going to be, this is an early kind of theme of the campaign, right? Where there is no ground troops for the Confederates. It's going to help them move quickly, right? They're going to move quicker than their Union counterparts that do have infantry, so that's something, right? But they're not going to have this infantry. They're not going to have artillery. And so this is a great example, I think, of why Price is going to decline attacking these fortified positions, because it goes exactly the way it goes right here, right? And there's only 1,000 of the defenders. They highlighted that disparity in terms of numbers here in this account, where it's only 1,000 compared to 12,000. So on paper, it should kind of be a walkover, right? But if you have a determined defense, better supply, it's going to be an issue. So that's going to be at the back of Price's mind as he's continuing this campaign, and as we all are going to see here next week as it kind of pans out. We must also cover the sinking of the CSS Abermarle. Remember, we had the CSS Abermarle as a primary contributor in the operations around Plymouth, North Carolina, and the Pimlico Sound. Here we have an account of the sinking of the Abermarle by Lieutenant Cushing, who submitted the plan to destroy the famous ironclad. At this stage of affairs, Admiral S.P. Lee spoke to me of the case when I proposed a plan for her capture or destruction. I submitted in writing 2 plans. The first was based upon the fact that through a thick swamp the ironclad might be approached to within a few hundred yards, whence India rubber boats, to be inflated and carried upon men's backs, might transport a boarding party of 100 men. In the second plan, the offensive force was to be conveyed in 2 very small, low-pressure steamers, each armed with a torpedo and a howitzer. In the latter, which had my preference, I intended that one boat should dash in, while the other stood by to throw canister and to renew the attempt if the first should fail. It would be useful to pick up our men if the attacking boat was disabled. Admiral Lee believed that the plan was a good one, and ordered me to Washington to submit it to the Secretary of the Navy. Mr. Fox, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, doubted the merit of the project, but concluded to order me to New York to purchase suitable vessels. Finding some boats building for picket duty, I proceeded to fit them out. They were open launches, about 30 feet in length, with small engines and propelled by a screw. A 12-pound howitzer was fitted to the bow of each, and a boom was rigged some 14 feet in length, swinging by a gooseneck hinge to the bluff of the bow. A topping lift carried to a stanchion inboard, raised or lowered in, and the torpedo was fitted into an iron slide at the end. This was extended to be detached from the boom by means of a heel jigger leading inboard, and to be exploded by another line, connecting with a pin, which held a grape shot over a nipple and cap. The torpedo was the invention of Engineer Lay of the Navy and was introduced by Chief Engineer Wood. Everything being completed, we started to the southward, taking the boats through the canals to the Chesapeake Bay. My best boat, having been lost and going down to Norfolk, I proceeded with the other through the Chesapeake and Abermarle Canal. Halfway through, the canal was filled, but finding a small creek that emptied into it below the obstruction, I endeavored to find my way through. Encountering a mill dam, we waited for high water and ran the launch over it. Below, she grounded, but I got a flatboat, and taking out a gun and coal, succeeded in 2 days in getting her through. Passing with but 7 men through the canal, where for 30 miles there had been no guard or Union inhabitant, I reached the Sound and ran before a gale of wind to Roanoke Island. In the middle of the night, I steamed off in the darkness, and the morning was out of sight. 50 miles up the Sound, I found the fleet anchored off the mouth of the river, and awaiting the ram's presence. Here, for the first time, I disclosed to my officers and men our object, and told them they were at liberty to go or not, as they pleased. These, 7 in number, all volunteered. One of them, Mr. Howarth, of the Monticello, had been with me repeatedly in expeditions of peril. The Roanoke River is a stream averaging 150 yards in width and quite deep. 8 miles from the mouth was the town of Plymouth, where the ram was moored. Several thousand soldiers occupied towns and forts and held both banks of the stream. A mile below the ram was the wreck of the Spoutfield, with hurricane deck above the water, and on this a guard was stationed. Thus it was impossible to attack with hopes of success. Impossibilities are for the timid. We determined to overcome all obstacles. On the night of the 27th of October, we entered the river, taking into a small cutter with a few men, whose duty was to dash aboard the wreck of the Southfield at the first hail and prevent a rocket from being ignited. We passed within 30 feet of the pickets without discovery and neared the vessel, and I thought that it might be better to board her and take her alive, having in the 2 boats 20 men well armed with revolvers, cutlasses, and hand grenades. To be sure, there were 10 times our number on the ship and thousands nearby, but it surprises everything, and I thought if her fasts were cut at the instant of boarding, we might overcome those on board, take her into the stream, and use her iron sides to protect us afterward from the forts. Knowing the town, I concluded to land at the lower wharf, creep around, and suddenly dash aboard from the bank. But just as I was sheering in close to the wharf, a hail came, sharp and quick, from the ironclad, and in an instant was repeated. I at once directed the cutter to cast off and go down to capture the guard left in our rear, and ordering all steam, went at the dark mountain of iron in front of us. A heavy fire was at once opened upon us, not only from the ship, but from men stationed on the shore. This did not disable us, and we neared them rapidly. A large fire now blazed upon the bank, and by its light I discovered the unfortunate fact that there was a circle of logs around the Abermarle, boomed well out from her side, with the very intention of preventing the action of torpedoes. To examine them more closely, I ran alongside until amidships, received the enemy's fire, and sheered off for the purpose of turning 100 yards away, and going at the boom squarely at right angles, trusting to their having been long enough in the water to have become slimy, in which case my boat, under full headway, would bump up against them and slip over them into the pen of the ram. This was my only chance of success, and once over the obstruction, my boat would never get out again. As I turned, the whole back of my coat was torn out by buckshot, and the sole of my shoe was carried away. The fire was very severe. In a lull of the firing, the captain demanding what boat it was. All my men gave comical answers, and mine was a dose of canister from the howitzer. In another instant, we struck the logs and were over, with headway nearly gone, slowly forging up under the enemy's quarter port. 10 feet from us, the muzzle of a rifle gun looked into our faces, and every word of a command on board was distinctly heard. My clothing was perforated with bullets as I stood in the bow, the heel jigger in my right hand, and the exploding line in my left. We were near enough then, and I ordered the boom lowered until the forward motion of the launch carried the torpedo under the ram's overhang. A strong pull of the detaching line, a moment's waiting for the torpedo to rise under the hull, and I hauled in the left hand just cut by a bullet. The explosion took place at the same instant that 100 pounds of grape, at 10 feet range, crashed among us, and the dense mass of water thrown out by the torpedo came down with choking weight upon us. Twice refusing surrender, I commanded the men to save themselves, and throwing off sword, revolver, shoes, and coat, struck out from the disabled and sinking boat into the river. It was cold, long after the frosts, and the water chilled the blood, while the whole surface of the stream was plowed by grape and musketry, and my nearest friends, the fleet, were 12 miles away. But anything was better than to fall into rebel hands, so I swam for the opposite shore. As I neared it, a man, Samuel Higgins, fireman, one of my crew, gave a great gurgling yell and went down. The rebels were out in boats, picking up my men, and one of the boats, attracted by the sound, pulled in my direction. I heard my own name mentioned, but I was not seen. I now struck out down the stream and was soon far enough away, again attempting landing. This time, as I struggled to reach the bank, I heard a groan in the river behind me, and although very much exhausted, concluded to turn and give aid, in my power, to the officer or seaman who had bravely shared the danger with me. Swimming in the night with eye at level of the water, one can have no idea of distance and labors, as I did, under the discouraging thought that no headway is made. But if I were to drown that night, I had at least an opportunity of dying while struggling to aid another. Nearing the swimmer, it proved to be acting master's mate, Woodman, who could swim no longer. Knocking his cap from his head, I used my right arm to sustain him and ordered him to strike out. For 10 minutes at least, I think, he managed to keep afloat. When, his physical force being completely gone, he sank like a stone. Again, alone in the water, I directed my course toward the town side of the river, not making much headway, as my strokes were now very feeble. My clothes being soaked and heavy, and a little chopped sea splashing with choking persistence into my mouth every time I gasped for breath. Still, there was a determination not to sink, a will not to give up, and I kept up a sort of mechanical motion long after my bodily force was in fact expended. At last, and not a moment too soon, I touched the soft mud, and in the excitement of the first shock, I raised my body and made one step forward, then fell, and remained halt in the mud, and half in the water until daylight, unable even to crawl on hands and knees, nearly frozen, with my brain in a whirl, but with one thing strong in me, fixed the determination to escape. As day dawned, I found myself in a point of swamp that enters the suburbs of Plymouth, and not 40 yards from one of the forts. The sun came out bright and warm, proving most cheering visant, and giving me back a good portion of the strength which I had been deprived of before. Its light showed me the town swarming with soldiers and sailors, who moved about excitedly, as if angry at some sudden shock. It was a source of satisfaction to me to know that I had pulled the wire that set all those figures moving. But as I had no desire of being discovered, my first object was to get into a dry fringe of rushes that edged the swamp. But to do this required me to pass over 30 or 40 feet of open ground, right under the eye of a sentinel who walked the parapet. Watching until he turned for a moment, I made a dash across the space, but was only halfway over when he again turned, and forced me to drop down right between two paths, and almost entirely unshielded. Perhaps I was unobserved because of the mud that covered me, and made me blown with the earth. At all events, the soldier continued his tramp for some time, while I, flat on my back, lay waiting for another chance for action. Soon a party of 4 men came down the path at my right, 2 of them being officers, and passed me so close as to almost tread upon my arm. They were conversing upon the events of the previous night, and were wondering how it was done, entirely unaware of the presence of one who could give them all the information. This proved to be the necessity of regaining the swamp, sinking my heels and elbows into the earth, and forcing my body inch by inch toward it. For 5 hours then, with bare feet, head, and hands, I made my way where I venture to say none ever did before, until I came at last to a clear place, where I might rest upon solid ground. The cypress swamp was a network of thorns and briars that cut into my flesh at every step, like knives frequently, when the soft mire would not bear my weight. I was forced to throw my body upon it at length, and haul myself upon the arms. Hands and feet were raw when I reached the clearing, and yet my difficulties were but commenced. A working party of soldiers was in the opening, engaging in sinking some schooners in the river to obstruct the channel. I passed 20 yards in their rear through a corn furrow, and gained some woods below. Here I encountered a Negro, and after serving out to him $20 in greenbacks and some texts of scripture, I had confidence enough to his fidelity to send him into town for news of the ram. When he returned, there was no longer a doubt that she had gone down. I went on again and plunged into the swamp so thick that I had only the sun for a guide. I could not see 10 feet in advance. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I came out from the dense mass of reeds upon the bank of one of the deep, narrow streams that abound there, and right opposite to the only road in the vicinity. It seemed providential, for 30 yards above or below, I never should have been seen the road, and might have struggled on until worn out and starved, I should find a never to be discovered grave. As it was, my fortune had led me to where a picket party of 7 soldiers were posted, having a little flat-bottomed, square-ended skiff toggled to the root of a cypress tree that squirmed like a snake in the inky water. Watching them until they went back a few yards to eat, I crept into the stream and swam over, keeping the big tree between myself and them, and making for the skiff. Gaining the bank, I quietly cast loose the boat and floated behind it some 30 yards around the first bend, when I got in and paddled away, as only a man whose liberty was at stake. Hour after hour I paddled, never ceasing for a moment, first on one side and then the other, while sunshine passed into twilight, and that was swallowed into a thick darkness, only relieved by a few faint star rays that penetrated the heavy swamp currents on either side. At last I reached the mouth of the Roanoke, and found the open sound before me. My frail boat could not have lived in the ordinary sea there, but it chanced to be very calm, leaving only a slight swell, which was, however, sufficient to influence my boat, so I was forced to paddle upon one side to keep her on the intended course. After steering by star for perhaps 2 hours, for where I thought the fleet might be, I at length discovered one of the vessels, and after a long time got within hail. My ship ahoy was given with the last of my strength, and I fell powerless with a splash into the water in the bottom of the boat, and awaited results. I had paddled every minute for 10 successive hours, and for 4 my body had been asleep, with the exception of my arms and brain. The picket vessel, Valley City, upon hearing the hail, at once got under way, at the same time lowering our boats and taking a precaution against torpedoes. It was some time before they would pick me up, being convinced that I was the rebel conductor of an infernal machine, and that Lieutenant Cushing had died the night before. At last I was on board, had imbibed a little brandy and water. I was on my way to the flagship. As soon as it became returned, rockets were thrown up upon all hands called to cheer the ship, and when I announced success, all the commanding officers were summoned on board to deliberate upon a plan of attack. In the morning I was well again in every way, with the exception of hands and feet, and had the pleasure of exchanging shots with the batteries that I had inspected the day before. I was sent in the Valley City to report to Admiral Porter at Hampton Roads, and soon after Plymouth and the whole district of the Abermarle, deprived of the ironclad's protection, fell as easy prey to Commander Macomb and our fleet. So there we go. We have a great account of the actual operation, the raid in which the CSS Abermarle is destroyed, and then, of course, the account of the escape, a harrowing account of escape by Lieutenant Cushing, Commander Cushing here, who gets away and is able to tell the tale. So the Abermarle was actually going to be raised by the U.S. Navy and then taken to Norfolk to refit, but this time it would be actually 1865 and is going to be condemned. But I oftentimes have a little summary of what you're about to hear. I thought it was better to maybe hear this one just straight up to kind of give you an idea of the operation, its success, and then eventually, of course, this escape attempt. A little bit of a surprise maybe if you don't know what already happened to that ironclad. So we're going to go ahead and call it a day there. We started Price's expedition into Missouri with the Battle of Fort Davidson. Thomas Ewing had successfully punched Price in the mouth before escaping. We also had the sinking of the CSS Abermarle, one less Confederate ironclad to deal with. Next week we will stay in Missouri. We will conclude Price's expedition with another Gettysburg of the West, aptly named the Battle of Westport. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.